In these articles, I talk about the six fields of China de-Americanization process in the past 7 years or past 8 years. One is the de-Americanization of trade, and the de-Americanization of finance, and de-Americanization of security, and de-Americanization of ideology, and de-Americanization of high tech, and the de-Americanization of education. So I list a lot of database to show and prove my observation. And I think, as you asked, the so-called de-Americanization strategy is not something China proactively presumed, but rather something it was forced into by the United States. In fact, since China reform and opening up in 1978, China has consistently sought to establish a friendly relationship with the United States, adopting an open policy towards the U.S., attracting American investment, in increasing a trade with the U.S., and learning from the management experience of American company and the financial market. But I give you a very horrible, a very huge data. That is, by the 2016, by 2016, about 20% of China foreign trade was dependent on the United States. Frankly, I admit these independence benefited benefited China in the past. But however, soon after, during his first term, President Trump began implementing policy to contain China, launching a trade war against China, detaining Huawei, Miss Meng Wanzhou, and imposing the sanctions on thousands of Chinese companies, including Huawei. And this containment policy made China feel threatened and promoting countermeasures and adjustment. And as I point out in an article published in New York Times in August of 2022, I said the Chinese people have now awakened and no longer hold the United States in such a high regard. And the Chinese people increasingly believe that relying on the US, as they did in the past, is dangerous. From this perspective, it was United States that forced China to adopt the so-called de-Americanization strategy. And I also wrote in another articles this year that I said the Chinese people should actually thank Trump, because President Trump was like an excellent political education teacher, teaching Chinese people to see through American hypocrisy and cruelty of the international society or international community. And more importantly, President Trump teaching us how to take necessary countermeasures to defend our country's core interest in modernization process. So this is what I mean, the so-called de-Americanization's purpose.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that scholars and politicians recognize that there will always be some competition between the great powers. And well, it's important to be honest about this because then you can be able to identify where it's possible to compromise, where one can harmonize interests and cooperate, while at the same time also recognizing that there will be competition. So how can this be managed and how can this be mitigated, especially the hardest zero-sum aspects of this competition. And again, ideally make it friendly competition as opposed to militarizing economic disputes. But if you look at the extreme economic concentration in the United States in the 1990s, globalization meant Americanization to a large extent. That is, we're all using American technologies, industries, shipping corridors, banks and currency, and well, all of it. So as the distribution of power shifts, it's quite reasonable to assume that the relationships will have to change as well. It opens up areas of cooperation and competition. So it's this whole de-Americanization. I think it's recognition of reality. But I did want to ask though, as China now diversifies this trade away from the United States to become less dependent, what do you see being the the larger consequences in terms of how the entire world or the international economic system is structured.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. You ask a very important questions, because in terms of my understanding, since China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, China has increasingly emphasized the cooperation with a country in global south. And the total bilateral trade between China and Russia, China and Central Asia, China and Latin American, China and Africa, China and Southeast Asia has grown by more than 10% annually. And meanwhile, total trade between China and the United States has seen a relatively decline over the past decade. So these I call the de-Americanization, or these structural adjustments has also led to China becoming less relies on the U.S. in its trade relationship, as you mentioned right now. For example, I give you some data. 5 years ago, bilateral trade between China and Russia was only slightly over 100 billion US dollars. But now, 5 years later, now it has reached 250 billion US dollars, and it is expected to exceed 300 billion US dollar in the next 5 years. The bilateral trade between China and Latin America has already surpassed 500 billion US dollars, and it is likely to exceed the total trade between China and the US in the next 5 years. Because nowadays, this year, the bilateral trade between China and US is only about maybe 500 billion US dollars. So that means in other words, in China foreign trade landscape, Latin American may become more important than the United States in the next 5 years, right? That's I think diversification. So therefore, in my view, the U.S. will still be a very important trading partner for China in the future, but its importance is declining. The strategic result of China de-Americanization of trade is that China global trade structure has become more balanced and more secure. This is a key reason. This is a key reason why China countermeasure against the U.S. trade war this year, in 2025, was so successful. Now, China is not afraid of the U.S. in the trade war. On the contrary, as many media outlets have reported, the U.S. has already lost the U.S.-China trade war of 2025. The main reason is that the U.S. share in China foreign trade landscape is declining. As I said, in 2015, U.S.-China trade accounting for about 20% of China total foreign trade, but now it is only 9%. And on the other hand, the rebalancing of China's foreign trade structure is beneficial to the development of countries around the world. China has exported more high quality and affordable goods to the world, achieving a democratization of goods, democratization of production, and helping developing countries in global south